First story: the cure they don't want you to find. In the wreckage of civilization, loneliness becomes your constant companion. Cities are silent ruins, overgrown with vines and decay, populated only by the occasional shuffling figure, the undead. For Sam, this was his reality. Once he'd been a scientist, a botanist studying rare plants for their medicinal potential. Now he was just another survivor, scraping by in the wasteland, hoping to avoid the undead and whatever was left of the human race. But Sam had a secret, a glimmer of hope in this bleak world. It started a few months ago when he discovered a rare plant, Mortemia vitalis, growing deep within a hidden valley. Its leaves oozed a viscous, venom-like sap, unlike anything Sam had ever seen. Driven by both desperation and scientific curiosity, he sampled the plant, studying it day and night in his makeshift lab. Through trial and error, he discovered that the sap had potent antiviral properties. He tested it on himself, exposing himself to small doses of the zombie virus. Astonishingly, it worked. The sap neutralized the virus, rendering it inert. But growing the plant on a larger scale was impossible alone. He needed a safe location, proper resources, and manpower to farm the plant and create a viable cure. Sam knew this discovery could save countless lives, maybe even reverse the apocalypse itself. But to achieve this, he'd need allies. Against his instincts, Sam decided to take a risk. He reached out to a group called the Watchers, a resistance group claiming to seek a cure and the restoration of humanity. In secrecy, he sent them his findings, hoping they'd provide him with the support he needed. Days passed with no response. Sam tried to shake the growing feeling of dread in his gut, telling himself the Watchers were simply slow to act. Until, one night, he received a cryptic radio message. "Keep your discovery to yourself. This world isn't ready for a cure." Then silence. They didn't even identify themselves, but Sam could tell from the tone it was a warning, a threat. Undeterred, Sam continued working on cultivating the plant, isolating himself deeper in the wilderness, where even the undead seldom wandered. Months went by in quiet research. He began to perfect his methods, even treating a few infected animals with the plant's venom, witnessing them gradually return to a docile state, their rabid aggression dissipating. The plant held the answer. But then, one night, Sam's camp was raided. Masked men stormed in, their footsteps silent as they set fire to his crops, smashed his equipment, and ransacked his notes. Before he could react, they injected him with something that left him paralyzed and unconscious. When he awoke, Sam was alone in a small, dark room, stripped of his belongings and bound to a chair. Across from him stood a figure clad in black tactical gear, face obscured. The figure spoke in a low, menacing voice. "You shouldn't have tried to play God," they said. "The world doesn't need a cure, it needs control. This virus is a solution, not a problem. Those who survive, they're the worthy." Rage and fear clashed within Sam as he struggled against his restraints. He'd seen firsthand the devastation wrought by the virus. The cruelty of letting this plague continue for some misguided philosophy was beyond him. With cold determination, he addressed his captor. "You don't get it, do you? The world doesn't need more death. It needs a chance to start again." His captor merely chuckled. "Your cure threatens the balance, and anyone who tries to upset that balance will be dealt with." Sam was left in the dark room for days, surviving on scraps of food they gave him, his mind racing with desperation and rage. But even as they kept him captive, they failed to realize Sam had memorized his research, his notes, and the process of growing Mortemia vitalis. It was his life's work, and no amount of captivity could erase that knowledge. Finally, after what felt like weeks, Sam's chance came. During a transfer to another facility, he managed to overpower a guard, securing a weapon and escaping into the wilderness. The men in control would no doubt send search parties after him, but Sam knew where he was going, to a location he'd marked months ago, a place where the last of the Mortemia vitalis might still grow. Weeks of hiding, scavenging, and fighting for survival followed. The undead were a constant threat, but worse were the occasional encounters with the black-clad agents, who seemed to appear out of nowhere, always just a step behind him. Sam knew he was running out of time. His only hope lay in reaching the valley and cultivating a sample of the plant before they caught him. At last, he arrived. In a remote canyon, shielded from prying eyes, Sam found the last patch of Mortemia vitalis. Carefully, he began his work, preparing the soil, extracting the venom, and recreating his lab with whatever salvage supplies he could find. But he knew they would come for him. It was only a matter of time. As he worked, Sam began recording his findings in a journal, hoping that even if he failed, someone else might stumble upon his work and continue the fight for a cure. The undead were closing in, lured by the sounds of his lab work, and the agents would not be far behind. But he kept pushing forward, desperate to finish before it was too late. On the last day of his work, just as he prepared the final extract, he heard footsteps echoing in the canyon. His pursuers had found him. With a final burst of determination, Sam injected himself with the completed antidote, knowing he was now the only living source of the cure. They could take his work, burn his notes, and destroy his lab, but they couldn't erase the cure from his blood. As the agents closed in, Sam realized the irony. He was the cure, but he'd have to survive to deliver it to the world. With the undead groaning in the distance, the agents advancing, and his life hanging in the balance, he vowed that he'd see this through to the end. The cure existed now, and he would stop at nothing to make sure it reached humanity. No matter how many shadows tried to silence him. Second story, The Last Light. Dr. Lila Harrison was a world-renowned biologist before everything fell apart. Now, she was just another survivor, living alone in the crumbling city, surrounded by darkness and silence. Her days were spent scavenging supplies, hunting for anything that could extend her isolated life in the abandoned apartment she called home. But her nights were haunted by them. The infected didn't move in daylight. They roamed only under the cover of night, lurking in shadows, drawn by even the slightest flicker of light. Over time, the virus had transformed them into something worse than undead. They were cunning, capable of working together, and chillingly silent. Only their glowing, reflective eyes betrayed them in the darkness. Each night, Lila fortified her walls and triple-checked her barricades. She'd managed to build a greenhouse on the rooftop, using old UV lamps to grow vegetables and keep herself sustained. But she knew this life wasn't sustainable, not long-term. She was running low on power for the lamps, and even her water filtration system was failing. The city was her cage, and her time was running out. Her work in the last days of the world had focused on a rare plant species, Amanita lucidus, which had an unusual immunity-boosting property. She had been close to synthesizing something when the outbreak reached their lab. Now her samples were gone, her research notes destroyed in the chaos of the evacuation. But whispers on a cracked emergency radio hinted that a final government facility in the city center might have supplies left. Maybe even her plant samples. Desperate and out of options, Lila decided to make the journey. It was risky, but the thought of finding a cure, of possibly ending this nightmare, was worth the danger. As she crept through the city streets in the early dawn, avoiding the spots where infected might hide, Lila felt a flicker of hope for the first time in years. After hours of dodging danger and moving with painstaking caution, she finally reached the high-rise where the government had supposedly set up their last facility. Inside, she moved silently, hoping the infected hadn't nested here. But the silence felt wrong. Too heavy. As she ventured deeper into the building, she found signs of a massacre. Torn clothes, bloodstains, remnants of panicked people who had tried to find refuge. But there were no bodies, just an eerie emptiness. Finally, she reached the research floor, where a small lab room sat locked behind a reinforced door. She managed to hack the entry code with tools from her pack, and the door creaked open, revealing shelves filled with vials, equipment, and notes. Her heart leapt as she saw a plant specimen of Amanita lucidus, carefully stored in a sterile case. Here was the missing piece. Just as she gathered the samples, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. A low, guttural growl from down the hall. The infected had found her. Panicking, Lila grabbed as many vials as she could and slammed the door shut, quickly barricading it with whatever she could find. Shadows flickered under the door as they moved outside, scratching at the walls, their groans growing louder. Her flashlight began to flicker, and she could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She'd have to get out before they broke through. But the worst was yet to come. As she turned to find an exit route, she spotted a monitor displaying a live camera feed from other rooms. Her heart dropped as she saw the infected gathered around something that wasn't a corpse, but a person, shackled and alive. Her finger hovered over the camera controls as she zoomed in. The man's eyes were hollow, skin pale, and his body thin and bruised, but he was human. Somehow, someone else had survived, captured here like an experiment. She watched in horror as the infected seemed to avoid him, as if something about him repelled them. A horrifying realization dawned. Had he been injected with some variation of the cure? Was he immune? In the panic of survival, Lila knew she couldn't stay to find out. She had what she came for. The plants, the samples, the chance at a cure. It was in her hands. But the presence of the man haunted her, his face etched in her mind as she made her way back to the city's outskirts. As dawn began to break, Lila's fear subsided, replaced with grim determination. The plants she now carried were precious, the key to saving humanity. But she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. There were others out there, survivors who may have been subjected to horrific experiments and left to rot. And as she reached her barricaded apartment, her mind kept returning to the man's face on the monitor, to the empty, unseeing eyes. She couldn't shake the thought that perhaps he was a warning or a message from the ones who had unleashed the virus. They didn't want a cure. They wanted control. With one final glance out her window, Lila knew her days were numbered. The infected would find her soon enough, drawn by the scent of fresh life. But as she clutched the precious samples, she vowed to hold on to the hope she had rediscovered. Because the end of the world wasn't just about survival, it was about reclaiming what was taken. Third story. Shadows of the Past. Jackson Hayes had once lived an ordinary life. He was a father, a husband, and a paramedic, the kind of man people called in times of crisis. His days were a blur of hospital shifts and late-night coffee breaks, often heading home to find his daughter asleep on the couch, waiting up for him with a book or a stuffed animal by her side. He'd always felt the weight of responsibility, but he'd loved his family, his life. Then came the first reports, a mysterious illness spreading across the city, turning people hostile, unpredictable. In those early days, no one called it a zombie apocalypse. The media danced around words like infection and violent behavior. But Jackson knew something was wrong. People were turning, and it wasn't just sickness. He'd witnessed it up close, as the first infected were brought in, thrashing and clawing, eyes wide with mindless aggression. They were strapped down and eventually sedated. But there was a cold dread in everyone's eyes. Something dark and uncontainable was at play. Days later, when the outbreak reached critical levels, Jackson's family was on the other side of the city, visiting his in-laws. Desperation clawed at him as he navigated streets choked with abandoned cars and panic-stricken crowds trying to get to them. But by the time he arrived, the house was dark, windows shattered, the signs of struggle painfully evident. He called out for them until his voice was hoarse, but the silence that answered was as hollow as the aching pit in his chest. With no word from his wife or daughter, Jackson took refuge in his paramedic training, his mind slipping into survival mode. He gathered supplies, fortified his house, and held out hope, scanning every radio frequency for a voice, a name, anything. Days became weeks, and weeks turned into a solitary existence filled with endless foraging and waiting. Months later, a faint broadcast broke the silence. Something about a government safe zone just beyond the city limits. The voice was calm, reassuring, and Jackson felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. He packed his few belongings and ventured out, hoping to find not only shelter, but answers about the outbreak, and maybe even a way to reunite with his family. As he approached the edge of the city, he found the safe zone was anything but. It was a wasteland of abandoned vehicles, and silence hung heavy in the air. His instincts told him to turn back, but the desperation for answers outweighed his caution. Steeling himself, Jackson ventured into the deserted compound, where he was greeted by row after row of makeshift beds and medical equipment strewn about as if in a hurried evacuation. In the far corner of the room, he found a wall covered in reports and files, haphazardly pinned, as if in a last-ditch attempt to document the outbreak's origins. He began reading through them, his breath catching as he pieced together the grim reality. The outbreak hadn't been an accident. It was the result of a failed military experiment, an attempt to create a biological weapon that could control aggression and alter behavior. But the virus had mutated, becoming something far more sinister, spreading with a speed and brutality that couldn't be contained. One file mentioned a plant, a rare species with antiviral properties, known to exist in only a few remote locations. Researchers had been close to synthesizing a treatment when the outbreak accelerated beyond control. The scientists involved had vanished, likely victims of the very creation they sought to cure. In the dim, flickering light, Jackson felt an overwhelming mix of rage and sorrow. All the lives lost, his family torn away from him, all for a government experiment gone wrong. But he wasn't ready to give up. If this plant was real, and if a cure was possible, then there was a reason for him to keep going. Before he left, Jackson heard a faint sound behind him. He turned to see a young woman, her clothes ragged and her face gaunt, staring at him from the shadows. She looked at him with haunted eyes, and he realized she, too, had found this place, perhaps searching for hope or salvation, just like him. "What's left out there?" she whispered, her voice breaking the silence like shattered glass. Jackson looked at her, the weight of his own grief mirrored in her expression. "Nothing, but I know where we might find something that can change that." The two of them left together, an unlikely alliance formed in the ruins of their shattered lives. Over the months, they would face countless horrors: the infected lurking in abandoned buildings, raiders who preyed on the weak, and the omnipresent shadow of the government, which would stop at nothing to cover up their experiment, even if it meant eliminating anyone searching for the cure. As Jackson continued his journey, the faint image of his family remained etched in his mind. Their faces haunted him, spurring him forward with each step. The truth behind the outbreak was a dark secret, one that the powers in control were determined to keep buried. But he couldn't stop now. If there was a chance to end the suffering, to bring back some semblance of peace to the world, he had to see it through. Because in the end, Jackson wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for redemption, for a future his family, and for a glimmer of hope in a world lost to shadows and lies.